For my Indigenous cookbook experience, I decided to make Sean Sherman's squash and apple soup with fresh cranberry sauce. Conveniently, I already had most of the items that I needed on the ingredient list at home, so all I needed to do was go to the store and get sunflower oil, a wild onion, an apple, vegetable stock, sumac if I could find it, and cranberries. I decided to go to Walmart because I knew they'd have a wide variety of items to choose from and they'd most likely have the unique supplies that I needed. However, despite me only needing about 4 or 5 items at the store, it still took me about 35 minutes just to find these items, so that proves how difficult it was to actually find them. After gathering the sunflower oil, the shallots, an apple, some vegetable stock, and some cranberries, I was finally able to head home and start working on making it. I decided to start with the homemade cranberry sauce so it would be ready when the soup was done. The first step to making the cranberry sauce is to wash the berries and rid them of any dirt or impurities. The second step is to combine 1½ cups of cranberries, a 1/4 cup of cider, a 1/4 cup of maple syrup, and some salts and some crushed juniper into a saucepan. Simmer it until the cranberries pop on the small burner. The third step is to cook the ingredients on medium heat until the cranberries have popped and the mixture is thick.
Okay, so that's pulling it through. Should we be able to see it yet?
Yeah, we can already see it.
You can already see it. You sure can. Look at that. Oh, that's cool. Mixing from that side.
After the mixture has thickened, the next step is to sieve it into a bowl with a fine mesh strainer.
Oh, that's so stinking cool. I love it. You know why I love it? Laminar flow. Can you imagine how perfectly they have to level this? This is gonna come off. And then you have to make sure that the flow into the little organ.
After the time-consuming process of sieving it over a bowl, you get this gelatin-like substance that is just like the cranberry sauce you buy at the store. After covering the cranberry sauce and putting it in the fridge to chill, I began to work on the squash and apple soup. I began to make the soup by prepping all the ingredients first. I began prep by chopping up the vegetables and fruits that will go in the soup. Normally I would peel the apple before I put it in any cooking, but the recipe never called for it and I figured it had something to do with the texture in the end, so I left the skin on. Maybe. Because the skin of acorn squash is so thick, it is very important that you have a very sharp knife and you keep your fingers away from the knife in case it cuts loose and accidentally cuts your hands or something like that. The next step is to peel the skin off. You can either use a potato peeler, however I was afraid of skinning my knuckles with that, so I'm using a paring knife. Just make sure if you use a paring knife, you know how to actually use it and don't cut your hands off. After I got all the skins peeled off, which was a very time-consuming process, I began to cube the acorn squash into relatively equal sizes. And again, make sure that your knife is sharp when you're doing this because it does kind of pop loose once you get through and it could come and hit your hands. And that is also another safety precaution you need to keep in mind when cutting these. Unlike the acorn squash, the butternut squash you can peel right away before you begin cutting it, and of course after you cut off the top and bottom. The reason we didn't do that with the acorn squash is because it has some crevices in it which are kind of hard to peel around unless you cut between those and eliminate them. So after you get done peeling the butternut squash, you want to cut it straight down the middle vertically and begin scooping out the innards so you can cut it up into small pieces.
Oh my gosh. I need like a grapefruit spoon for this.
After you scoop it out, you want to cut it up into cubes just like we did the acorn squash. Try to keep them all about the same size so they cook about equally.
Well, when it jiggles. Yeah, I think it's an old time thing. I think it's like they haven't done it in a long time.
Okay, so the recipe I'm using called for 2 pounds of winter squash, so that includes acorn squash and butternut squash. So I'm going to do 1.25 pounds of butternut and 3/4 pounds of acorn. And then I also called for a tart apple, so I chose a Granny Smith. Here it is cubed there. All of these need to be cubed, of course. And then it also calls for a wild onion or a shallot. Unfortunately, I could not find wild onions, so we are using shallots.
The first step to cooking these is to saute them in a pan with a little bit of sunflower oil to keep the vegetables from sticking long enough until the onion is kind of transparent and the vegetables have a little bit of a char in them, but not too much.
So I sauteed the cubed vegetables and onions in this saute pan and put them in this pot. I put in already 2 cups of vegetable stock. You're supposed to use corn stock if you can, but I could not find any. Putting in the third, and then I'm adding 1 cup of apple cider and about a tablespoon of maple syrup. Open it. Just eyeball it. Okay, and then we let that simmer for about 20 minutes until the squash is like really soft. So we'll let that go. Okay, so this has been stewing for way over 20 minutes. They said to cook it for about 20 minutes, but I really needed the squash to be soft so I could puree it. So I let it go a little longer than what they suggested. So the recipe book calls to use an emulsion blender, however I do not have one, so we're just going to use blender, but I don't want to crack the bowl, so I'm going to let it cool down a little bit. And here, and I'll let that sit until it's not boiling hot. Alright, so I just put these in the water bath to cool it down a little bit faster. Now they're ready to get put into the blender. So I'm going to take it over. I'll actually take this out. and we'll heat it up and it should be ready to serve.
After heating it up in the pot for a couple minutes until it was starting to bubble, I dished out a couple of servings into some bowls, and I took the cranberry sauce I had made earlier and put a spoonful in each bowl, and this was the final product. It kind of looks pretty bougie, and so now we're ready to taste it. I decided that my subject that would be tasting the soup today would be my boyfriend and cameraman today, and we'll see what he thinks of it.
So this is the squash and apple soup. Do you want to try it for me? What do you think?
I think it's pretty tasty. It's pretty mild, but yeah, it's actually really good. Way better than I expected. Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah.
Overall, I thought this project was pretty eye-opening. I didn't realize how hard it would be to find some of the ingredients, and I even chose one of the easier recipes, but looking through the book, I have noticed that half these things in the book are not even available in the store, such as sumac. I knew where to get it, though I was unable to forage it because I was worried that it could be poisonous, like I had read in the book. Another thing that was in the book that was hard to find was juniper, and so I had to replace that with pepper, same as I did the sumac with lemon juice. And overall, though, the recipe was not very expensive. Acorn squash and butternut squash are relatively cheap compared to other fresh fruits and vegetables, and they are pretty popular in American culture, so I was easily able to get those. Um, there was a pretty time-intensive project, though. It took me, I think, half an hour to just peel the acorn squash, which is insane, just because the skin is so thick. But I overall think it was a pretty good recipe. It was a little different for my taste. It was kind of bland. I wish there could have been some sweet cream or something in there, but pretty good. Better than I thought.